My third year of rabbinical school, I served a student pulpit in Fort Smith, Arkansas. Anyone ever been there? Southerner, of course, right? Usually we have a few people. Once a month, I would get up really early on Friday morning and I would go to Newark Airport and fly from Newark to Dallas and then on to the tiny airport, and I mean tiny airport, in Fort Smith. This fascinating, at the time, small congregation dated back to the early 19th century, and its members included German World War II refugees, longtime Southern Jews, and some adults who had embraced Judaism in this small southern town on the Arkansas-Oklahoma border. In those days, American Airlines had a really good in-flight magazine that had content, dare I say, that was worth reading. At least there was always one thought essay that I would turn to when I got on the plane. It wasn't about what to see in a city or what you should buy next time you went into their market or store. And on one of my flights, I picked up that magazine, American Way, and an essay caught my eye. The piece reflected on the difference between a traveler and a tourist. A traveler, it says, looks out at the journey as an opportunity to see and learn and grow. The traveler moves from one stop to the next, but is not so focused on the destination. That is, not to just get to that site and check it off and move to the next one. The traveler takes the long view and recognizes that there are highs and lows in the journey, and all of them are part of the experience, giving insight from the journey. For the traveler, the essay writes, motion creates its own meaning. It gives a sense of purpose, a feeling of working steadily towards some unknown goal. The tourist, on the other hand, the writer explains, hurries from place to place, intent on reaching each destination for its own sake and checking it off on a physical or mental list. And ultimately, this writer said, the tourist is soon happy to head back home. In this essay, the two groupings was a travel magazine, right? So they were used to talk about people who were physically hitting the road or going in the sky. But as I read the essay, I took it in another way. It spoke to me powerfully as a life metaphor. The metaphor calls us to consider, how do we view that journey we call life? How do we view our own destinations and goals? Is it about the endpoints, or about the journey, or maybe both? Now, to be fair, like so many broad classifications, this one is very broad. And few of us are exclusively in one camp or the other. Many of us are, no doubt, in a composite place. At times, we might go from one place to the next and mark them off on our list. And we may even declare loudly, I got here, I've achieved that goal. And at other times, we may step back and look at the greater journey and the possibility inherent not at those big landmarks, those famous places, but in that wrong turn, that passing conversation, or that hole-in-the-wall place we stumbled on when we made that wrong turn. At different times, we may look from the perspective of a traveler or a tourist, depending on our history, our current situation, and our realities at that time, physical, emotional, spiritual, and I'm sure many other things. And while some of us may jump to put a valence on being a traveler or a tourist, saying one is better or worse, I encourage you not to. Instead, think of these two classifications first as informing one another and as an invitation to look from both vantages. For me, 3 decades ago, doing so provided with a real mental paradigm shift and a challenge to consider how I viewed physical travel and also how I view travel on that journey of life. No surprise, that metaphor also works in Torah. Torah lists starting points and journeys of our ancestors in this week's Torah portion, Maseh. The list is actually kind of dry and undetailed. The opening verses says that these were the journeys of the Israelites as led by Moses and Aaron as they left Egypt. And many are named. I'll give you a few. It says they left Ramses before Passover. They camped at Sukkot and they camped at Etam on the edge of the wilderness. They left Etam and they turned. They camped at Marah. They set out from Elim. They set out from Elim and camped by the Sea of Reeds. Scintillating, right? They set out from the Sea of Reeds and camped in the wilderness of Sin. That's worth noting, Sea of Reeds, right? Getting out of Egypt. Many verses and lists of starting and camping sites later, Torah explains that our ancestors camped in the steppes of Moab at the Jordan River near Jericho. That is, they were at the edge of the promised land of Canaan. Every year I read this list. It reads kind of like a laundry list, but as I do, my mind wanders. I wonder, what were the experiences of our ancestors as they journeyed? What happened? What didn't make that list? What did they learn? What did they find out about themselves? Were our ancestors looking at the entire journey, or are they just trying to get to the next place, trudging through the desert? Midrash, interestingly, views this list as more than just a litany of stops, even though it reads that way. Our sages understand it this way, saying that God said to Moses, record the journeys that Israel took in the desert, in order that they should know what kind of miracles I, that is God, performed for them. How will they know, God asks? From all that they read regarding the words, these are the journeys. In other words, what the rabbis are saying is they were to write down the journeys and then share the list back with the travelers. Again, great rabbinic imagination filling in the blanks of what else was there. The list was to be shared back with the travelers so that they could review where they traveled and gain insight. The rabbis saw this list as reminders of something greater. In this case, the stops that were the happenings at these places, where God brought our ancestors to safety, helped them across the Red Sea or Sea of Reeds, fed them manna when they were hungry, gave them water, provided them food. And there was the learning in these happenings. And keep in mind, these were not all good stops. It wasn't like going to, Paris and seeing the lights from the Eiffel Tower at night. Our ancestors, as you may recall, had some really tough times in the wilderness. The rabbis lift up the fact that miracles happened, brought by God. And our commentators also point out that there were good places and there were bad places and good places, but our ancestors didn't know. They didn't know what was going to happen in advance, and they kept going. Sound a little familiar? Kind of like life? We don't really know what's going to happen next, even if we try really hard to control it. Our sages' teaching is actually, to me, a really powerful invitation to reflect on our own journeys. Sure, our physical travels, now that we're beginning to travel again, and our lives. We could name the stops in our lives, right? I went to elementary school here, I went to high school here, this was my first job, I got married, I got divorced, I had a child, I lost a friend, I fell in love, I earned that degree, I said goodbye to someone. I don't mean to make light of any of those, but we could just list it. We could list the places. This is where I studied, or where I fell, or where I laughed, or where I cried. I lived here for a while, I lived there longer, I moved from that apartment, I waded through the mud over here, I succeeded here, I failed there, I made a friend over here. We can list them as a tourist might and just move from one event or place to the next. Or we can take the midrashic advice. We can record the places, either on a list that's written or in our minds, and review that list. We can name the places that we set out from, and the places we lived, the spots that things happened, and do so with the vantage of a traveler, with an eye toward the small wonders, the large miracles, the insights we gained even at the darkest times. How about the conversations that changed our thinking, the tough times that impacted our understanding, or the people who challenged us, who really caused us to question, and those who caused us to be grateful, to step back and say thank you. The traveler doesn't always have easy paths, nor does the tourist. But when the traveler steps back to look at the stops of the journey, who knows what they'll gain? Wisdom, purpose, maybe even redemption, as our ancestors ultimately did. As I read Torah, I truly wonder if our ancestors actually had that long game perspective of a traveler. I tend to think not. They did a lot of kvetching. We don't like the food, we're thirsty, we want to go back to Egypt, we want to go back to Egypt, we want to go back to Egypt. But let's learn from them. Sure, we'll have moments of kvetching too. We don't like the food. We don't like what's going on. It's really difficult times that we never imagined. The goal is not to justify the difficult times or explain them away. But the goal is to look at all of our starts, of our stops on the journey, and look to our own promised land. Maybe it's not a fixed destination or a static place. But what if we look at it as an evolving location of purpose and meaning as we keep moving forward? So let us keep moving forward and look for the potential, the wisdom, the insight around the next bend on that winding road we call life. Shabbat Shalom.